Baby boomers, what issues existed when you were young that made you think your elders were idiots? Asked my grandma and she said the protection of children at the time. Both my great-grandma's parents died and left their 9 kids with just a 14-year-old, my great-grandma, to look after them. No support from the government until she accidentally killed her 5-year-old sister while cutting vegetables and turning around too quickly with a knife. Court ruled her for manslaughter, and since she was the only caretaker, she was allowed to stay home and some of the kids were taken. They didn't intervene until a child died. My grandma rants about this a lot when I complain about my siblings. At least I haven't been stabbed yet. She accidentally killed her 5-year-old sister while cutting vegetables. Dude, what the frick? F67 here, right in the middle of the boomers. As a lot of people have said, Vietnam was insane, but our parents didn't seem to get what bothered us. They thought of war as World War II, something you did BC. It was right. We saw politicians lying to us. It wasn't like Iraq, either, where at least people who went had volunteered. And on TV every night, they'd do body counts. How many of us died? How many of them died? This was when I was in high school, and all 3 of my older brothers were in the military, 2 of them in the war zone. Aside from that, freaking television shows were almost uniformly stupid. Sitcoms, JFC, so bad. Double standards. I had brothers and a sister, and when we were kids the boys played out whilst us girls did the housework, etc. I'm talking cleaning windows with water and vinegar, and a chamois leather and scrunched up newspaper, followed by ironing everything for a 10-person household. We started this at around 8 years old. Edit. They were weekly tasks in a 5-bedroomed house, with 5 downstairs rooms, plus bathrooms and utility. We also had to the daily washing up, part of the cooking, serving up the meals, brewing the tea, all of the vacuuming, downstairs daily, upstairs weekly. My sister did the laundry twice a week in a twin tub washer and a mangle. She also had to get up before everyone else to set the fire in the grate. I had to change all of the bedding once per week. We had to iron the sheets and underwear. God, the memories. And there's tons of stuff I forgot. Also, girls don't ride bikes, so the boys got all the cool presents and we got dolls, or a board game, or a play kitchen between us, or, which was even more insulting, somehow, a sodding packet of bath cube things that smelled of processed chemicals but was labeled patchouli. My brothers got a transistor radio and a Casio watch each. My sister got a pair of American tan tights, size XL. She was a skinny waif. I'm all for sharing housework amongst kids and parents. I totally am. But it has to be shared regardless of gender because that only reinforces stereotypes. I've only got sons, who are now adults, obs, and they all know how to keep a house. Back in the day, every household was like this, or so it seemed. I had to fight to get my partners to muck in and do their bit. I'm pretty sure this part of my upbringing contributes to my anger when I hear about this unfairness still existing today. I read so many posts on Reddit about boyfriend husband won't clean, says it's my job and so forth, and it gets me so mad. On the upside, things seem to be changing faster and faster. 15 years ago my dad couldn't boil pasta to save his life. Today he shares the housework. My BF wouldn't dream of saying it's my job or that he can't do something because he doesn't know how. The Vietnam War, Watergate, the gas crunch and economic downturn of the 70s, mutually assured destruction, the ozone hole above Antarctica, smog alerts, DDT, boomer, here, M58, F58, DDT though, horrid I know, but god dang it killed the mosquitoes. Still recall chasing a horsefly, hitting it with that pump action, and it just falling to the ground. Now at 58, on 02, 24/7, so yeah, it was effed up. Seatbelts, in particular the fight against them. As a 10-year-old they seemed perfectly logical, yet lots of the grown-ups were opposed to their introduction. Credit cards. My parents' understanding was that any debt was a bad thing. It was so ingrained that I still hold this value. My brainwashing means that, though my bank offers free banking if I use my card, I still draw cash out from the ATM. To buy my first house, I simply saved and paid in full, and in cash. Same with all purchases. To buy my first house, I simply saved and paid in full, and in cash. This is the kind of crap that gets people fired up and angry about how fricked up our economy is today. I've literally never heard of someone my age doing this. The big issue was Vietnam. There was a draft, and 18-year-olds were sent into this meat grinder of a war that we shouldn't have been in and nobody believed in. I mean, not even LBJ, the president at the time, believed we should have been there. Nobody wanted to pull out, and nobody wanted to do what was necessary to win. So kids were just being slaughtered, and it was pretty terrible for the Vietnamese too, of course. But there was so much more. Music. My parents' generation didn't get rock and roll at all. I remember my father predicting that the Beatles would be forgotten in 6 weeks, following their appearance on the Ed Sullivan Show. Sexuality, free love was a thing among those dirty hippie freaks, completely alien to the morality of the day, which was to stay a virgin until married. For girls, guys were expected to frick anything that moved. It's a bit disconcerting for me to see that boomers have become the idiots in so many ways. I feel like every generation just hates whatever music the newer generation is listening to. I bet your parents' grandparents were like stupid kids listening to blues and jazz. Back in my day we listened to Mozart and Beethoven. That's real music. It's probably been said, but sexism was woven into every facet of life. Girls were told outright that they could not be doctors, etc. It started in early childhood when we were expected to be neat and clean and helpless, and our brothers expected to explore, try things and learn from their mistakes. Brothers being taken seriously from the moment they could talk. Girls expected to listen to their advice on absolutely anything. The dress codes. No pants allowed at school. Sexual harassment was officially called "you don't have a sense of humor and he likes you." Someone posted an old police report recently that officially said the group of male teenagers dragged the servant girl into the bedroom and scared her. One of my parents is one of the youngest boomers, technically the last year or so of being considered a boomer, born in the early 60s. And something that they always thought was so dumb was how about half of their generation would spend money to max out the limit of their credit. They would always talk about how people they knew would spend as much money as possible on as many things as possible as soon as they had a credit available for it. Spending the max amount you get pre-approved for a house. Spending the max amount you have available on credit cards. And when those are full, opening new credit cards. And not on necessities, but on frivolous things. I think when people say boomers ruined the economy, what that really means is like half of the boomers ruined the economy, while the other half sat there screaming. Dude, it's crazy how often my parents talked about people they knew doing that. I don't know a single person within 10 years of my age who would dare max out a credit card. Apparently in the 80s people thought credit cards were free money. Maybe it's akin to our generation oversharing in the early days of social media. Just people going too far with an unfamiliar technology. Pesticides. Pesticides everywhere. Okay, you are a great boomer. When my father called Led Zeppelin's music electronic rubbish, he was pissed when I pointed out that they have more money than he did. To be fair to your dad, just because someone's successful doesn't mean they don't suck. Speaking for my late father, who was a great, funny guy for an old sergeant in the army, he always told me that his parents were pretty demanding. He lived with them until he was 19, and the last 5 years of that time was him working hunting to fill their fridge full of food while dad's dad worked as a volunteer firefighter. They basically made him think that, because they birthed him, he pretty much owed them a debt for life. The debt for life is something that just grinds my gears. Like, yeah, maybe you birthed me and raised me, but I didn't ask you to do that. Raising a kid you chose to have isn't a favor. It's a responsibility, and it's time to stop holding that over kids' heads. Vietnam, of course. Having teen and early 20s classmates go to war and die for reasons that still aren't clear to me today. The draft. No volunteer army like now, and only rich fricks with bone spurs could buy their way out of it. Pollution. Rivers that literally burned because they were so full of toxic chemicals. Smog that blanketed cities and could be seen for hundreds of miles. Pesticides everywhere. Smoking everywhere. In closed cars. Thanks mom and dad. In airplanes. Even in hospitals. Even the doctors and nurses. The EPA was started in 1970 to deal with some of these issues. Now gutted by Trump. The threat of nuclear war. I remember in my college days paying close attention to the doomsday clock. I really believed we would be nuked into oblivion in my lifetime. The ridiculous hypocrisy of weed being illegal but alcohol, Valium popping moms, and cigarettes being legal. Boys, young men being spat on, yelled at, not being hired if they had long hair, which meant below the collar. Seriously, likewise, as a girl having to wear nylons and closed-toed shoes to school. Job ads in the newspaper that were separated by gender. The women's job section were limited to secretary, teacher, nurse, childcare, maybe bank tellers. And it was simply expected that if you were good looking and female, you had to put up with sexist comments and groping in the workplace. In my first job, I was told that of course the men made more money, they had families to support. If you were a boy who wanted a non-traditionally man's job, you were automatically a sissy. Absent fathers. Fathers as a rule did not parent. I know this is a generalization, but it was true for everyone I personally knew. Corporal punishment, hitting, spanking, was totally acceptable. Even teachers could spank a kid and no one would say a thing. I feel as if ours was the last generation, boomer, of kids where spanking was fairly universally accepted, so we must have not been okay with that. Using a computer. When the first desktop computers appeared at work, all the older employees absolutely lost their minds. They couldn't believe this thing could do all this stuff and were extremely intimidated by it. Not much has changed. I'm British. 50. The generation before me, my parents, were brought up believing that they were invincible, that Britain and the British people were the best in the world at everything. They truly believed that everybody else in the world should bow down to our superiority. This was because their parents had fought and won World War II and their grandparents, World War I. They ruined British industry through their incompetence and naive belief that British shite would sell worldwide simply because it was British. Productivity regularly ground to a halt as unions would call strikes far too regularly, bringing the country to its knees, eventually leading to Thatcherism and the beginning of the look after number one culture. The generation before that, my grandparents, were heroes, lest we forget. Sounds like what the UK is doing again with Brexit, thinking it has the influence of America on the world stage and can compete with China and EU in manufacturing, services etc. while tearing up all its trade agreements worldwide, so we'll have tariffs on anything it does manufacture. Just feels like we already want to be Starship UK and fly away from the planet. Systemic racism. Not just Vietnam but neo-colonialist adventures all over the world. Poverty here. Women being legal second-class citizens. Discrimination was totally legal. Canned music. Canned food. Jello molds with mayonnaise in them. Jello molds with mayonnaise in them. I'm sorry, what? I'm not a boomer but I was called one on Reddit today. Gen Zs get confused. I get it. It's cool, so I'll answer. My thing was homosexuality and the AIDS crisis, and why it had to be such a secret. My uncle was gay. I found out much later, and he had to ask my parents' permission to let us call his roommate Uncle D, but that's as close as they let us come to learning the big G word. I seriously thought he was my bio uncle. Get this, there was a freaking AIDS hospice across the street from my childhood home, and my parents never explained to us why people went in but they never came out. They'd say stuff like, oh that guy went on vacation, you just missed him. Why? They thought they were protecting us, but kids are curious, so just tell us WTF is going on so we're not left wondering why Uncle D suddenly isn't our uncle anymore, or why we can't wave back at the old man who smiles longingly at people through the window across the street. Dear God, Dad, that man died alone. Let your 6-year-old kid wave at him at least. Not a boomer but Agent Orange has taken 2 of my uncles almost 50 years after exposure and is presently rotting my father's heart, who had had open heart at 55. Now he has a pacemaker, enlarged heart and advanced heart disease. Frick the makers of Agent Orange, and the politicians still sending young Americans to die for greed and resource thievery. My grandmother was an illegitimate child born in rural Scotland in 1900. She was automatically branded as the devil's spawn and abused and ultimately abandoned by her family. As a little girl, a school teacher took pity on her, recognized her potential and adopted her. She grew up to become a fierce advocate for the downtrodden and discarded of this world. She became an activist and prolific writer as a voice for those who had none. She also was fiercely anti-religion because it was the church who condemned her, an innocent baby, for having the misfortune of being born out of wedlock. It was disgusting the way that society treated less fortunate folk all in the name of their twisted religion. She wasn't the idiot. She is my champion and my hero. It was her elders that came before her that were idiots. Edit. I'm a boomer. My grandma and her parents were of the lost generation. My elders. Not a boomer. A baby boomer was born between 1946 and 1965. War, pollution, nukes, religion, racism, sexism and conformity. Ugh. Everybody was so uptight and boring. Seriously, in 1978 I wore some red shoes in Texas and people were so horrified you would have thunk I stabbed a nun. War, pollution, nukes, religion, racism, sexism and conformity. Ugh. We didn't start the FIA. Not that I'm admitting to being a boomer, but they thought marijuana was evil. Racism. I was following American politics in the late 60s and early 70s and could not understand why people discriminated against others because of race. Things like the riots on TV really made me question my parents' generation. People, especially down south, discriminate against other races because it makes them feel superior. No matter how trashy, no account and ignorant they are, they have someone to point at and say, at least I ain't no N-word. You can be the biggest redneck bottom feeder in the state, but you can still look down on someone for that reason. That's the real root of racism down here. As a boomer, I'd like to quote one of our generation's great poets and say, we didn't start the fire. It was always burning since the world's been turning. I think we all know that Ryan started the fire. My boomer relatives always complained about not having enough money, their houses, clothes, multiple sports cars, 5 ski-doos, boats, ATVs, camping trailers, apple orchard, cottage, plane tickets for vacations every year, 5-story estate, 3 deep freezers of food were bought for them by their parents. They consumed it all and there is nothing left. They all earn over $150 K a year and some of them over $300 K and are all broke. Idiots. So many it's hard to count. The war in Vietnam. It led to the idea that old enough to serve in the military, old enough to vote dropping the voting age from 21 to 18. That marijuana was classified as a drug that had no redeeming value. Normal sentences for possession were 1 or more years in prison, plus fines. It has only come to light since the turn of the century that, on the federal level, drug laws, especially marijuana and H, were made so strict was due to Nixon wanting a way to control those that he felt were his enemies, especially the young Vietnam protesters and the African American community. Especially marijuana and H. Well, H is kind of a crappy drug. They are not even used medically despite being way better painkillers than morphine. Okay, I've seen a lot of Vietnam War comments, but what about non-Americans who had no war? What were you complaining about? Everyone's chiming in about Vietnam, and I concur. But I want to add something that seems to me to be the bigger issue, and that was my mystification, when a kid, over how folks around me couldn't see that heavy militarization was, in general, an abnegation, if not an outright repudiation of decent Republican governments. Of course, some folks could see, and that was evidenced in cultural artifacts like Steppenwolf's a monster and such like. So that was there to reassure me that at least I wasn't alone. One thing people don't mention was the aftermath of World War II on society. Specialists are now claiming that World War II was the reason for the spike in serial killers in the 60s, 70s and 80s. I mean, you have to think about how many broken homes and alcoholic fathers with PTSD were a direct result of that war. My mother was very critical and judgmental. When we were trying to buy our first house, she said, I paid $50 down and $50 a month. What is your problem? Of course, it was much more than that then, but for us it was nothing compared to now. I have no idea how millennials manage today. I grew up in rural Oregon and there was unapologetic racism, sexism, you name it. Most of those people are Trump supporters today. I found them confusing then and seriously dangerous today. Thank you for your compassion. My father-in-law talks about the church, Catholic South in the Netherlands. The priest would come and scold you if you didn't have enough children. The priest had known about wives and children that were abused but did nothing about it. Gen X here. But from everything my folks told me about it, war, conservatism, pollution and intolerance were the headline issues. Which makes it all the more ironic that we are where we are now. Turns out that the myth of a generation of peace-loving hippies was a construction of the media bearing little similarity to actual reality. Which makes it all the more ironic. Repeat till bored. It's a long list. An unjust war, a criminal government, a cruel and inhumane society. Kinda like these days I guess, including that we are the ones who saw the horrors and could do nothing to change it. And many of you did try. They thought it was okay to force us to fight in a pointless war. They shot us when we protested. They put gays and transvestites in jail. They thought it was okay to make a woman get her husband's okay to get credit, or fire her if she got married, or to deny her control over her own body. They thought that people who complained about discrimination were being uppity. They also went through the most traumatic event in history, and I knew people in that era who thought that all of the above were wrong. So I am done blaming an entire cohort just because they were born at a certain time. The first time someone suggested in the German parliament that rape in a marriage was bad, there was a lot of laughter. Everyone agreed that it could not possibly be rape, because the wife had agreed to sex by marrying the husband. Well, this question made me feel old. I'm not a boomer, but I do remember that the Vietnam War and boomer generation were a thing that kind of went hand in hand. Something that was common knowledge. Vietnam War, Woodstock, bell bottoms. That was that generation. Oldest of the Gen Zs here, on the cusp of boomership, issues from my teens and early 20s, nuclear weapons and disarmament. I was worried sick that Reagan would get us in a war with the Soviets and we would all die. I remember when I told people I was in favor of disarmament, they'd jump to the conclusion I supported unilateral disarmament. No, I supported bilateral, mutually verifiable disarmament. Dumbass. AIDS was becoming a thing, and the Reagan administration's silence on it was a matter of major criticism against him. Pollution, aerosols destroying the ozone layer, and the greenhouse effect, global warming. Yes, it was a concern back then too, and now we are seeing its effects because we did little to stop it when we had ample chance to do so. The rise of the religious right, with groups like the moral majority waging what would later come to be known as the culture war. The Iran-Contra scandal, and how disappointing it was that it didn't lead to the downfall of Reagan and his cronies. I asked my mom and she kinda thought about it and went, well, babies used to die a lot more, and I thought that surely there had to be more that doctors could do to help. Her sister, my aunt, had a baby that she thought had a fever. The doctors told her she was hysterical, and then the baby died from pneumonia. Racial discrimination. My parents were of the era of being okay with white-only waiting rooms and drinking fountains. I was in high school when civil rights protests became a media thing in the public consciousness and young people at the time began to actively protest. Pollution. My parents were uninvolved and unconcerned about pollution. Companies were dumping their industrial waste in rivers and the air with impunity. This is when the Cuyahoga River caught fire. Air pollution, smog, in Southern California actually made my lungs hurt. Acid rain was a major problem on the East Coast. It wasn't until I was in college that I participated in the first Earth Day protest. Finally, in 1970 the EPA was established as a cabinet post. Vietnam and the draft. My parents were among those who wanted to stop the spread of communism in SE Asia. The domino effect where country after country would supposedly fall under the control of communist China. I got my draft notice, but the war was winding down and I never actually was called to report for induction. Smoking. Our parents smoked wherever they wanted, in restaurants, planes, trains, buses, and especially in the office. There was nowhere to escape older people smoking. Watch episodes of Mad Men. It was exactly like that. Older people were still smoking in the offices I worked in through the late 70s. Here's the thing, though, it was their normal. It takes rebellious youth sometimes to bring about change, and that needs to continue throughout every successive generation. The younger generations carry the hope for the future. Can't really say that I ever thought along those lines about anyone in my family, and being the youngest, even the third youngest among all my cousins, everyone was older. I was brought up to have a great deal of respect and regard for those older, with more experience than I. I still tend to feel the same way, at least until someone proves me wrong, and give me a good reason to think they're an idiot. For my mom, it was that her parents couldn't understand why she wanted to go to college and refused to help beyond dropping her off at the dorm. They wanted her to go to a secretary school. My uncle had everything paid for by them through grad school. In no particular order: domino theory, corporal punishment, never-ending wars, Native American policies, greed is good. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.